Hello, this is Andrew from Hexacrafter. This is part one of our video series on assembly of the Hexacrafter HC 650 or 800 series. They both go together in a very similar fashion. So in order to put the arm assembly, motor mount assembly together, you'll need the following items: a 3mm hex driver, a 2mm hex driver, or a 2mm piece of wire. This is a piece of 12 gauge housing wire. Works the same. A pair of forceps that are long and locking, and a nail file. About 150 grit is what I typically use. These are really good when working with carbon fiber for a lot of things. Obviously, you'll need an arm assembly. This could either be a 650 series or an 800 series. And the same with the motor mounts, an upper and a lower motor mount, as well as the screws that you'll need. 4 6mm by 3mm screws, along with two 23mm standoffs, female style. 6 20mm standoffs, and 12 8mm long by 3mm screws. So this is the arm assembly, step one. We're going to build a standard arm assembly today. There's also an extended option where you flip the plates over to move the motor up, and then a protection ring goes above that. That'll be in a later video. So the very first thing I typically do is try and clean up the arm assembly from the machining process. It makes the assembly go easier. That's what the purpose of the nail file is. Inside the tube, after machining, sometimes there'll be some burrs inside here that'll make it difficult to get the standoff exactly where you need it. So you just take the file and clean up the inside of the tube with the file. Any place that there were burrs or anything hanging down inside the tube, same thing on both ends. Just clean up to make sure that any kind of obstruction on the inside has been removed, and the nail file works really good for that application. So the next step is to install the standoffs. You take it and lock it into the forcep so that it's locked in place, and you slide it up inside the arm assembly to align with the holes. This is where your 2mm thread, 2mm hex driver comes in handy, and that once you get it lined up, if you push it through, you can kind of align the hole real nice so that the screw goes in easy. So then you take 8mm long, 3mm diameter screws and hand screw them into the threads in either side of the standoff. Now, I'm going to stress that I do all of this without any kind of hex driver on the 3mm screws. I'm doing it all by hand. I think that's really important, in that if you are using a hex driver, you tend to maybe get too much thrust behind it if you get cross-threaded and end up doing damage to the threads. We don't want that. So that's why I typically don't use the hex driver until I'm pretty much all assembled. So again, using the hex driver 2mm to align things. Now, in the assembly process of these arms, this is probably the most difficult part of building the whole airframe. But the advantages to having the standoffs go through the tubes in a continuous structure far outweighs the little bit of effort it takes to make this happen. And that structurally it really makes a big difference in the overall strength of the airframe. We do offer a service to pre-assemble the arms for those that feel that this might be too big of a challenge for them. But as you can see in the video, it's really not all that difficult, especially if you have experience building any kind of hexacopter and or you know, a traditional airframe for a single rotor. This really isn't that difficult for those that have built airframes before. Again, I use the 2mm hex driver to align things real nice so that the screws go in easy and you're not fighting it at all. Again, you just feed it right into the end and get it aligned with the holes as best as you can by looking through the end of the tube. And then once you get it pretty close to position and can find it in there, that's when you can even use the wire that I was telling you about instead of a hex driver if you prefer to use that method to align it through the tube properly. And then start the screws by hand. Now, there's in most applications, the manufacturers are pressing for you to use a Loctite on the screws. Again, you can do that, but all in all, we feel that proper maintenance of the airframe is sometimes better. So, if you feel the need to add Loctite after the final assembly, that's also acceptable, but I typically don't use Loctite on anything but the motor to airframe connection. That's where most of the vibration would happen that would loosen up things. But feel free to Loctite everything if you feel it's necessary. I typically give my airframes a once over after a few flights and double check that all the fasteners are in place properly. I think that type of inspection is far more important than having confidence in an adhesive that the screws won't work their way loose. Like I say, sometimes it's just a matter of being patient and getting things properly aligned to get the screw in. But with proper alignment and some patience, they all go in. And once they're all in, the airframe really goes together easy. The ones on the ends are really very easy. It's the ones that are more buried that are a little more challenging. Again, I'm going to stress, and sorry if I repeat myself, I haven't used the 3mm driver at all at this point. I'm doing all this with just finger tightness and using my fingers to properly align them. That way you don't get cross-threaded in there and do damage. So there's the arm with the standoffs installed inside the tube. Note that all the screws are fairly loose, just finger tight, so that as you assemble it further you can make adjustments. But that part is the most difficult part. And then the rest of the process goes fairly easy. So this is a bottom motor mount. Note the way the screws go into the motor. Each motor comes off differently off of the 4 screws. So basically you have to pre-plan and know that you want your motors to come off the tab side of the arm assembly to feed through the tube without coming out of the side of the motor. It makes a much cleaner assembly. And additionally, you know, depending on which motor you have, you may have to flip the plate over to get the wires to align with the tube. So at this point you kind of unassemble what you've already assembled slightly, and then all you got to do is remove 3 screws at a time. You're using the 3 screws on the opposing side of the standoff to hold the standoff where it was positioned and aligned properly. And again, you're putting the plate on so that it properly aligns with the motor wires. One of the things I will stress here is that you want to not torque things down tight initially. You want to leave some serious play. Just get them started. Get maybe a millimeter or so of the threads started in the standoff. And leave everything with an air gap. I don't know if you can see it in the video, but there's an air gap between the motor mount and the tube. That air gap helps you get all the screws started, and again, doing without cross-threading. Now note, once they're all started, and you're not going to cross-thread, which they all are in this case, that's when you're finally going to use the 3mm driver. And you're going to work them all down little by little. You're not going to torque any one all the way down all at the same time. Again, and they should go easy. If you feel for any reason that there's tension in there, then you probably are going cross-threaded. Now, at this point, I just get them to the point that they just begin to hit the motor mount. That allows the standoffs to still move a little bit inside so that when we align the top plate, it goes on easy. So now that the bottom 3 screws are pretty much sitting in there flush but not tight, you can remove the top 3 screws. And install the top protection ring. Same methodology here. You want to basically get the screws started into the standoffs without cross-threading. You're not going to tighten them down, but about a millimeter of penetration. Once you know they're all started and going in the right way, by hand, then you can come back. Sometimes it takes a little adjustment, but ultimately they will all get in there with patience. Now that you have them all in, you can slowly torque them down like we described with the other one. Little by little you drive each one in. No one goes all the way in at one time. You're kind of torquing them down like you would a rim on a car if you've ever worked on a car. Work your way around the screws, working little by little until they're all torqued down. Again, you don't have to put a whole lot of torque on them, just enough that they're snug. And I haven't had them work loose on any airframe. If you want to go back and remove a screw at a time and add some Loctite to them, feel free, but I haven't found that to really be a necessary addition to the frames that I've built and flown. So the last part is fairly easy. It's just the last 2 standoffs that connect the 2 motor mounts together. They go in fairly easy. These are 23mm standoffs and 3x6mm long screws. And again, I'll stress this for the 3rd or 4th time in this video, in that you don't want to tighten everything down right initially. You want to kind of leave things loose That helps you get the pieces aligned without fighting the standoff as you do it. It really makes it easy. You can see how much that the standoff will move during the process if you leave the screw loose. If you tighten it right off the bat, then you really struggle trying to get the standoffs to align and get everything working properly. So once everything is just snugged down by fingers, you can come back with the 3mm and torque them down. Now, I don't even use a wrench on the standoff. The hex standoff, you can actually use a wrench to hold that while you rotate it. I kind of just work them side by side and let the two screws counteract each other and get them to the point that I feel that they're just comfortably snug. And that's the completed arm assembly. You can see the standoffs down inside, the tube assembly, as well as the exposed standoffs at the motor mount. On the other end, we have the screws all in place on both sides with the standoffs positioned inside and ready to fasten to the main frame assembly. So I hope that video helps explain how I put them together. They really go smooth and easy. If you don't feel comfortable doing this portion of the frame assembly, we do offer the service to pre-assemble the arms for you. So thank you very much. I'll see you in part 2, which will deal with the bottom center frame hub assembly. Thank you.